Hello and welcome back to the Godot community. My name is Sahira Dean. I'm the virtual PLC lead for high school 2D art. In today's webinar, we'll be looking specifically at AP rubrics, specifically the SSI rubric and then the selected works rubric. So this is the rubric for the SSI. I wanted to point out that each row holds its own weight, and that's notated on the screen. So the SSI rubric has to do specifically with the inquiry. That goes to making sure that the student has a really clear question. Now, that's not too broad, that's very specific. That is going to guide their research, that's going to guide their artwork. So if their question is way too broad or unclear or not clearly stated, essentially that will score the student at a 1. So you want to make sure that going into this, that their question is not too broad, but it's very clear and it guides their research. So row A of the rubric has to do with specifically the writing, in which the student is identifying the question or inquiry that guided their investigation. So if you look at the bottom in the blue, this actually guides the AP reader. So as the AP reader, we're trained like 2 days on reading and using the rubric to read the student work. So if you look at the bottom, read the student response, writing prompt 1. Is there an inquiry, seek, search, discover in the writing? If no, award point 1. If yes, you move to score point 2. So all these are decisions that we can use or to guide our, all these are prompts that we can use to guide our scoring throughout the scoring process. So I want to look at specifically score point 1 and some of the verbiage that's here. So written evidence identifies an inquiry, but visual evidence does not relate to that inquiry, or written evidence does not identify an inquiry. So the score point 1, if you look at the difference between 1 and the 2, there's the and. Written evidence identifies an inquiry that relates to the sustained investigation, and visual evidence demonstrates the sustained investigation. So if it does not have both of these, then you're automatically coded or scored a 1. But if it does have both of these, you look at 3. And I want to point out a difference here. Written evidence identifies an inquiry that guides the investigation, and visual evidence demonstrates the sustained investigation. So this guiding, does the writing guide the investigation, right? So you want to point that out to students. And when you're doing practice reads with your students in your classrooms, you want to make sure that they're familiar and comfortable with using the rubric, so that way they're familiar with what they'll be scored on and how to efficiently use it throughout the semester. So score, the row A is 20% of the overall score. Now we're going to move on to row B, which has to do again with the writing. Describe how your sustained investigation shows evidence of practice, experimentation, and revision guided by the inquiry. So if you're looking at score point 1, and again, you want to look at some of these deciding questions or driving questions down here that help to drive and determine whether it's a score of a 1, 2, or 3. And then you look at the weight of this. This is actually 30% of the overall score. So looking at a score of a 1, visual evidence of practice, experimentation, or revision. However, visual evidence does not relate to a sustained investigation. So if they're submitting images that do not relate to what they're doing and how they're doing it, they're automatically scored a point of 1. Moving up to score point 2, visual evidence of practice, experimentation, or revision relates to the sustained investigation, and written evidence relates to the visual evidence of practice, experimentation, or revision. So making sure that there are connections in what they're talking about and what they're doing. Awards them a score point of 2. And I want to point out the relates and then the does not relate. And then there's the and, right? So there's a connection between the visual and the written. So if all these questions are answered a yes, right, we're moving on to see if they are scored or they'll be considered to score a 3. So if you're looking at row 3 or column 3, visual evidence of practice, experimentation, and revision demonstrates development of the sustained investigation, and written evidence describes how the sustained investigation shows evidence of practice, experimentation, or revision. So if you're looking at the verbiage in score point 2 and 3, you have the and here, but you have the or here, right? So it has to be all of them in order to get the score point 3. And then you're looking at this and down here, which is the same as score point 2, but this describes as opposed to just relates. So making sure that students are being very clear in their writing, using the verbiage of the rubric, and also taking advantage on their slides to talk a little bit more about how specifically they're doing this. So the 100-character part, just making sure they're taking advantage of all that opportunity to write and explain in a very clear manner can award them a score point of a 3. But I must say that this, like if their question in the beginning is not very clear, it makes it very hard to get that score point of the 3. So row B is 30% of the overall SSI score. All right, now we're looking at row C and D. So row C has to do with just visual. Well, both C and D have to do with the visual imagery. And you look at the weight of C is 30%, and the weight of D is actually 20%. So 20% of the score is visual, but it has specifically relates to their skill. So I do emphasize that to students, especially students that are not feeling as confident, especially when we're going through some of the exemplar portfolios, that 20% of the overall score for the SSI is the skill. A lot of the weight has to do with your idea, you showing how you're coming up with your idea, and experimentation and revision, right? So 20% of the score is skill. So let's back up to row C, which is 30% of the overall score. And this is the only one that has to do with the visual. Row A and B had to do with specifically the writing and connections with the writing and their imagery. So if you're looking at score of 1, little to no evidence of visual relationships among materials, process, and ideas. So are they making connections with why they're choosing certain materials and media? Are they documenting it? Is it shown in their imagery? Row 2 or score 2, visual relationships among materials, process, or ideas are evident. So if you look at the difference between the verbiage, little to no, and then this shows evidence, right? So if they're just showing evidence, but maybe they're not making connections on the why, and the how questions, then they may stay at that score point of a 2. So they show it, but they are not showing the synthesis, which is awarded at score point 3. So visual relationships among materials, process, and ideas are clearly evident and demonstrate synthesis. So is the student talking about maybe some of the things that they did to document their weekend, or how are they showing it? So maybe they have some receipts that they saved to document that. That would be one idea to show synthesis. Maybe they're using some type of chiaroscuro to create some type of dramatic lighting that's specifically relevant to their investigation, and they're documenting how they're doing it. Those will be awarded that score point of a 3. Okay, so now looking at score point or row D, which again is the only row to talk about skill and is only 20% of the overall SSI score. It is important, of course, but it is a smaller weight. So visual evidence of rudimentary and moderate skill. So score point 2 goes to moderate and good, and then score point 3 goes to good and advanced. So essentially, how good are they utilizing the rules of 2D design or the rules of 3D design or their drawing skills? I must say that a lot of readers say that the drawing portfolio is a more difficult portfolio to get that score point of a 3. So when you're looking at your student work, just be sure that you're putting their portfolio in the right portfolio. And I must say that the 2D design portfolio is the most popular and biggest portfolio, just because it has a little bit more flexibility and is not as strict as the drawing portfolio. The selected works is 40% of the overall score. So the student submits 5 images that best demonstrate their 2D, 3D, or drawing skills, depending on what portfolio they're submitting. And again, they can use those 100 characters to talk specifically about their process, ideas, and materials. And this is another opportunity where they definitely want to make sure that they are being clear on the whys and the hows in their ideas. They only get 100 characters to do so, so want to make sure that they're specific in what they're doing. So the selected works is 40% of the overall score. And so if you look at the difference of the 60% of the SSI and the 40% of the selected works, the SSI does clearly have the most weight. So this is the rubric for the selected works, which is shorter, and the students can be awarded a score point of a 5, so 1 through 5. And the difference, of course, with the SSI, the students are awarded a 1 to 3. Okay, so one good thing about the rubric that the AP College Board offers is that they do give definitions for all these words that are in bold. So if you ever have a question about, oh, what do they mean? Or if you're stuck between a score point of a 3 and a 4, I encourage you to go back and look at how they define evident and clearly evident, good and advanced, so on and so forth. Okay. So I do want to talk a little bit about the syllabus before we wrap up this webinar. Use this opportunity with your students in terms of the syllabus to make sure that they are given specific dates and deadlines, and any questions that might be unclear or maybe need to be addressed, in class, that's all noted in the rubric. So if you look at the beginning of my semester, they had a mini investigation book due. We presented that in class. And if you look at the date, we had started school, I think, a week or 2 prior. And so a lot of that time in the beginning of the year, actually we started school at the beginning of August. But a lot of that time was spent on looking specifically at the rubrics and looking at previous portfolios that students had submitted, looking at the College Board website, making sure students were comfortable in using the rubric, and looking at the CED offered by the College Board. So I talk about, what a gallery walk is, making sure that everything is due ahead of time. And then they had a deadline for a specific revision, their first revision of the year. We had a process and experimentation week, which I'll talk about in the next webinar. And then we had a deep dive week in which they did some sharing and talking and rough drafts and writing about what their SSI was for the year. So thank you so much for tuning in today's webinar. I look forward to you joining me on the next one. Again, my name is Sahira Dean. I'm the virtual PLC lead for high school 2D art.